About the famous guy here, James Ussher, who actually took the Bible and he took the genealogies back at the beginning of the Bible, middle of the Bible, in the four Gospels, and he laid the genealogies, the people's lives, end to end. And by going from what was then the time they knew from Jesus, which was 2,000 years, he went all the way back and decided that not only did the earth get created in 4004 BC, he calculated down to October 23rd. 3 days from now, okay? And he published this in 1650. It actually became so prevalent, it was actually a footnote in the King James Version by 1700. And so everyone was believing at this point, for the most part, that the world began about 6,000 years ago. And so what's happened is, as the atheists have taken on their position and moved very violently against the idea that there's a God, this movement has arisen, which is, wait a minute, not only did God create the earth, he also created it 6,000 years ago. Which kind of now we've got this problem with, if science says the earth is, the universe is 15 billion years old, the earth looks 4.5 billion years old, what do we do with this? Can we believe in creationism? Or do we have to be an atheist? See, all of a sudden it becomes this either or. And that's not the case that we need to be thinking about here. And one of the issues that comes up for scientists who are believers is, if the earth is only 6,000 years old, and we go to the Grand Canyon, we see sedimentary rock that's 6,000 feet deep. We see on the surface of the earth sedimentary rock that many places about 80,000 feet deep all the way down. And when we look at the process of sediment, dirt falling down on the earth, and how long it takes for that to get crushed to become a rock under all that pressure, you need a lot more time than 6,000 years. Now, what the creationists with the big C do is they go, oh, we can solve all of that. There was this huge flood. The Bible talks about that. There was a huge flood. Everything got jumbled up into the water, and then it all settled back down, and all that water was all the way crushed back down again, and then it evaporated off. You go, oh, okay, good, that dealt with that. But what about those pesky dinosaur bones? Because when we look at the stratification of the bones, we see that the older ones always tend to be way at the bottom, and the younger ones tend to be way at the top. Well, you'd expect that, wouldn't you? However, the young ones are all the really big dinosaurs, the heavy bones. And the really old ones are the troglodytes, the really small things. And so if you jumble all that up in a bunch of water, what would go to the bottom first? The heavy stuff. So the younger should be at the bottom, and the older should be at the top. If the flood was going to solve the riddle for us on the 6,000 feet at the Grand Canyon and the 80,000 feet on the earth. So there's a lot of contortions that have to happen that just don't line up with science really well. So my point to you today is, atheism and creationism with the big C kind of are on the extremes. Creation with a little c, if you want to say that, Genesis 1:1, I'm all for that. That's not a problem. God created the earth in 6 days. Was it 6 literal days? Was it 6 poetic days? I don't really know. There's a lot of believers in our church that are professors, have PhDs. Some of them would say it was 6 literal days. We respect those guys. There's other guys and women out there that would say, no, I think like Peter talks about the fact that a day is like 1,000 years to God, and 1,000 years is like a day. Right. Oh, I see. There's relativistic language in certain places in the Bible. So when we understand that, then we don't get all weirded out when this becomes the issue. What we have to do is say, that's not the issue. The issue is, what does God want us to understand about what creation is about, what the universe is about, and really what is it that we're about here on earth. Next slide. Now the next loaded language, next slide please. Evolution versus the theory of evolution. Next slide, I must have had this set up to be cool, but it's taking up too much time. There we go. I'll give you my commentaries for moving along here. So, one thing we have to be careful about is conflating these two definitions. Some people speak of evolution as if it accounts for all life forms that we see on earth today. If evolution is true, why do we need a creator? I mean, really, that's the way it goes in school, isn't it? I have 3 teenagers. They go through this all the time and come home, and of course they got daddy who's a PhD who loves to take the teacher on. So my kid's future at the school, so I hold back. But the idea kind of goes that way. If evolution's true and it accounts for everything, why do we need a God? Evolution, defined as life forms have developed and diversified into new life forms, this evolution continues to occur today. There's lots of evidence for that. Even humans today are known not, some are born without wisdom teeth, some are born without appendices, as you say. And those are kind of people evolving. They don't have the pain of having them cut out, or unlike me at 16, exploding in your stomach. But there's evidence for this type of evolution occurring. The theory of evolution, however, is different. Life arose from non-life, and all life forms today can be accounted for by evolutionary change from simpler to more complex organisms.
Right.
Now, this theory of evolution is where the touchstone of the argument really is.
Right.
There's two main weaknesses in the theory of evolution. Number one, it cannot account for the origin of life. It cannot tell us how life began. It can try to explain to us, once life got here, how we went from single cells to human beings. There's not a lot of evidence for that though. The second major weakness is it cannot account for irreducible complexity. Irreducible complexity is an organ or an animal that you look at and say, how do I break it into its component pieces? Because if the theory of evolution is right, all those component pieces should have evolved and should have been something that made it competitive individually, and then it got put together. Next slide. Now this is really describing Darwin's black box. Darwin recognized this. In 1859, he published his book, Origin of Species. And it's a book that I think every scientist should read. I think you should understand. This man only had anatomy to look at. He was pretty brilliant in 1859 to go. He's kind of figuring out what looks alike and what doesn't look alike and how they must have fit together. What he didn't have was the benefit of molecular biology and biochemistry, which we then can look in and say, how does everything work? This how everything works was termed the black box in 1850, even all the way through the early 1900s, because people could not look in to see how things work. And Darwin had this quote in his book: if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. So that's one. All I need is one, and it would break down. The bombardier beetle here is an interesting example. And believe me, this is not the only one. This is just one that everybody can understand. The eyeball is another one. But we'll go through this one because it's really simple to understand. Natural selection, when you think about it, does not create anything new. Natural selection helps to preserve changes that occur and are beneficial. Changes that occur and are not beneficial, it wipes it out. Because only the competitive can survive. You follow me there on natural selection? So don't get confused, theory of evolution, natural selection. Theory of evolution is all about mutations and trying to move forward. Natural selection is the sieve that kind of puts it all in, shakes it around, and sees what remains. You following me there? In other words, the survival of the fittest does not explain the arrival of the fittest. The theory of evolution teaches genetic mutations give rise to new organs, etc. And it assumes that these mutations will confer some advantage. I have a mutation, it makes me stronger, makes me better. But this presents a challenge to irreducible complexity. The bombardier beetle has two big tanks in his hind. These two tanks carry two chemicals that are very, very corrosive. And when you put those two together at the same time, it shoots out a substance that's over 100 degrees C, that's boiling point, and it will go onto the face of anything that's trying to eat it. And if you look here, right there on the left side, I don't have a nice pointer, is a pair of tweezers. Okay? Those tweezers are grabbing its back leg. And it's shooting down this water onto those tweezers, or this chemical that's there. And it turns out, either one of those chemicals would kill the beetle by itself. Both of those chemicals inside the two tanks would actually explode inside the beetle if it just sat there. So one of them has an inhibitor inside it that's been identified. So it inhibits the first liquid from being dangerous. The second liquid, because it can't react with the first, is fine. But since that first inhibitor is there, it won't work. So there's a second molecule in the second tank called an anti-inhibitor. And when you spray these two liquids together with the inhibitor and the anti-inhibitor knocks out the inhibitor, and the two liquids are now extremely dangerous. And with them being extremely dangerous, they combine together, 212 degrees or 100 degrees C, and scalds whatever is behind it, and the beetle runs away unharmed. Now you tell me how each one of those four things happened through successive mutations without killing the beetle. Still waiting. I've thrown them out for 15 years. I haven't heard an answer. The eye is another one. There's many, many organs inside the human body that we all look at, and many scientists today are looking at this stuff and going, there's entire departments springing up around the country over the last 20 years dealing with irreducible complexity and dealing with the origins of life. Because people are now stepping back and going, Darwin really didn't answer everything for us. We've got to continue on looking to see if there's some answers. Next slide. Now I'm going to try to run through these next slides because this is probably the main part of the talk. The next piece of this talk is going to give you some foundational components here, but I really only have about 10 more minutes left. And so I want to spend some time going through this with you. These slides are going to be posted on the church's website for you, as well as the video is going to be posted for you, so you can go back and look at some of this stuff. So where we're going in the next 10 minutes or so is the concept of, well, how do we know there's a God behind all of this? And the classic arguments are a few. The first set of arguments are the design arguments. The first one is the teleological argument. That goes something along the lines of, if I was walking in the woods and I happened to come across a watch and it was ticking, what would my first thought be? Wow, this sprang out of nothing and came into being and it's still ticking. That's not your first thought. No. The first thought is there was a maker. There was a watchmaker. And the second thought is it wasn't so long ago because it's still ticking. Because if it weren't ticking anymore, then you'd realize, well, time had really passed a bit of time had passed. But you might still look at the design and go, okay, I understand that maybe there was a watchmaker somewhere. Paley, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, came up with this notion and applied it to the universe. And said, if you look at the universe, the intricacy of the machine and how it's working, the first thought should be there must be a designer behind it that created it. And on top of it, we're not frozen ice cold. Because if the universe had existed forever, all the energy would have been used up. And if all the energy was used up, our stars would be solid bricks, and we wouldn't be here today. So there must be energy that's still in this universe and still continuing. So this is a teleological argument on there must be a designer behind the design. Next slide. A more modern version of this design theory, it really comes in from the last 20 or 30 years from MIT and some other places. It's the idea of order. People used to look at snowflakes and say, wow, look at all this structure, look at the order. And what we've come to realize is that's an inherent property of water. If you just take water, you freeze it, it organizes itself, and under the microscope it's these beautiful crystals. But there's no information in that. You can't read anything from it other than it looks beautiful. However, there's other types of order that we realize there's information in that order. And a very simplistic idea, we'll get to DNA in just a minute. That's my PhD, so we'll get over there. But the idea of information with order, if one looked at these two mountains here, one is the man in the mountain, which actually sadly doesn't look that way anymore. But you would kind of look at it and go, that kind of looks like a human face, doesn't it? How did it arise? I don't really know. But if you stumbled across this one, what would you think? There's a lot of information there. I can actually tell who the presidents are. Somebody took something and imparted a lot of information into it so that when we look at it and read it, we go, that's order with information present. Next slide. When one has this type of order, one says to oneself, there must have been an intelligent cause behind it that created that order. Now, one of the things we talked about a few minutes ago is the concept of origin of life. Has Darwin answered this question for us? In the 21st century, this is the most important question that scientists are going after. No longer out into the abyss of space and what can we find. People are realizing we haven't answered this yet. The question to keep in mind is, how did life originate from non-life? How did complex order come from disorder? How did So the way to look at this is we started out with non-life, the primordial soup. We got to life, and then we get to highly developed life. Those question marks are where we're looking for answers. So one of the most famous experiments was done in the 50s by Urey and Miller. Their basic idea was the primordial soup must have had methane in it, or CO2, ammonia, and phosphorus. Those turn out to be the molecules you need for amino acids and the backbone of DNA. And if you had all that stuff in there and you zapped it with enough electricity, like lightning over time, you get some basic backbone materials. And then if they swam around a billion years or so and they were crashing into each other and forming bonds, then maybe we can come up with the amino acids to make the proteins. And then we could also come up with the bases to make the DNA. The problem was the gases that they suspected were on the early Earth, recently over the last 10 or 15 years, have been shown to not be the right gases. There was a high level of oxygen. And oxygen, as you know, when you have a spark, burns everything up. And so there's a real problem here when you're looking at pure oxygen being there and not being the source being from water or from CO2. Next slide. Now the building blocks are amino acids when it comes to proteins. And when people are looking at this, they actually get connected together end to end. Now, I don't want you to get caught up with these structures. But the issue is proteins are made of that. DNA are made of purines and pyrimidines, which are also building blocks. Carbohydrates are a fancy word for sugars, and we need sugars in our body to help build all kinds of chains. And then lipids are your fatty acids, which build the cell walls, which keep all the junk inside and the other stuff on the outside, so that the business end of your body can do what it's supposed to be doing. Next slide. So you have to have all of these things present in that primordial soup. And one of the big issues that has arisen is the amount of time. Remember I mentioned the Earth is about 4.5 billion years. And life came about 3.5 to 4 billion years. So there's only about 0.5 billion years or so in between the origin of the Earth and the first life that was present. And when I say first life, we're talking cells that were already functioning, not the first protein. So basically you can calculate the probability of these things coming in on into one another to create a full peptide or a full protein. And so if you have two forms of every amino acid, which we do in our body, it's a 50-50 chance you get the right one. There's multiple ways to connect the two together, this way or this way, which is a 50-50 chance. And then you have 20 different amino acids that are needed in your body. And so there's about a 5% chance of getting the right one in the right place. So that this was number 2, and you had to have the right one number 2. You only had a 5% chance if 20 of them were swimming around, that you'd get one of them, you stick it in the right place at the right time. So if you go to the next slide, you can have the next slide, please. We got to get these guys out to lunch. Come on. Next slide. I know we got a next slide. Oh, they're going to cut me out, I guess. Come on, Dave. And then you have 0.5 times 0.05 for position 2. And so the typical amino acid chain in the body is about 100. So you have to have 100 in the right order. So if you multiply those out for 100 amino acids, you actually come up with a probability of getting all of them in the right place at the right time. Now, I didn't make this up. This is from a bunch of biological scientists out there going, how did this happen? So if you look at that number, it's a 0 with 191 zeros after. Okay, all the way down to 49. That probability seems pretty low. Now, to give you an idea of how low that probability is, if I took quarters and I colored a red dot on one quarter, and I covered the surface of the United States, one layer thick, with all those quarters, and one of them had a red dot on it, and I said you get to walk across the entire United States, you get to pick up one quarter, what's the chance of getting the one with the red dot? That is 1 in this really big number, which actually is only 10 to the minus 19. That's a whole order of magnitude easier to do than getting the first protein out of the primordial soup that was functional. So scientists have looked at this and they calculated the amount of time it would take for these molecules to bump into one another and for them to form one protein. The average cell has about 2,000 to 3,000 proteins to make it function. functional. And I'm talking the basic cell that's out there, not cells that are in your body. So when you look at this, they calculated it out. It would take somewhere between 1.5 and 2 billion years of this crashing in the primordial soup for this to occur. How much time occurred between the beginning of the earth and the first cell that they found? 500 million. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. This is all wonderful stuff. Go online. Purchase it. Next slide. There we go. Okay. So the idea is we only had 500 million years between the beginning of the earth cooling down because it was really hot and finding the first cell there. We don't have enough time. So what scientists are now postulating, Francis Crick, who won the Nobel Prize for the structure of DNA, or co-won it, was the one that pushed this forward. Life must have come from outer space. Because how old is the universe? 15 billion years. Plenty of time out there, isn't there? So what they basically are saying is that there's no plausible answer to these problems. Everything points to a non-naturalistic intervention on Earth. So it must not have been God. It must have been a meteorite bringing it in and dropping it on Earth, and then it could grow. What this basically shows you is that science doesn't have some really strong answers for these sorts of things. It doesn't mean they won't find it. And that'd be great if they did. It would just reveal how God did it. But I think for us to just bury our heads like ostriches and go, evolution's answered everything. No, we look at this and say it hasn't answered everything yet. And we need to understand it. Now, as Christians, we point to this and say, well, yeah, we know God did it. It was a miracle because God said He did it. What I want to do now is close with, we're not going to get to the origins of the universe, which I wish we could. But what I'd like to do is end here with you in the conclusions. If you could just slide to the side of the conclusions. I'm not a physicist anyway, so I don't really know this part that well. Next slide. Next slide. Stop right there for just a moment. We might just spend a little bit. Well, the basic idea in the origin of the universe is this. There's an awful lot of design that's out there. And the thing that really amazes scientists is the anthropic principle. Anthros means man. So anthropic means of man. A principle that looks like man, what we would do as engineers. And so when they look into the universe, the scientists say, wow, this is pretty astounding. That if you look at many of the constants and parameters which we have in the universe, if these parameters are just a little bit off, either we would have no atmosphere on Earth, no water, no life, or we would be horribly crushed. And so if these constants, like the gravitational constant, wasn't what it is, our stars would be like bulbous masses that would just float apart, and there would be no warmth to keep the universe warm, or Earth and other places. If it was too strong, we'd be crushed. The strong nuclear force, we would have absolutely no hydrogen. This is what holds hydrogen together, which is the building block for all atoms and all molecules. This is going to be burned to the center. And the ozone level in the atmosphere, our atmosphere is but a mere 50 miles high. That may sound like a lot to you, but the infinite expanse of the universe, 50 miles is very narrow. Yet we survive because that number, this anthropic principle, is so detailed and strong. Next slide. So the idea here is from E. Harrison. Here is a cosmological proof of the existence of God. This is a physicist. The design argument of Paley, updated and refurbished. Paley, remember, is the water maker. The fine-tuning of the universe provides prima facie evidence of deistic design. Take your choice. Blind chance requires multitudes of universes, or design requires only one. Many scientists, when they admit their views, in the back room, incline toward the teleological or the design argument. So when one looks at the origin of life, and one looks at the origin of the universe, it points clearly back to the beginning, which clearly points to the hand of God. And if that's really where we're at, then we have to really ask ourselves, what do I believe? I think many times, a lot of us want God to part the heavens and show Himself. But those of us who know the Bible know what happened to men when they saw God. And really that takes away the element of faith, doesn't it? Because God ultimately wants us to believe in Him in faith. Now, if you could go to the conclusions. Next slide. Needs a few more slides. We'll close out here. Next slide. Next slide. So in the end here, for those of you who are believers, it makes sense to believe in God and to feel confident that your belief is based on the Bible, but science has really done nothing to undermine it. And that's important for you to believe. You need to be secure in your faith. Don't be intimidated by scientists who made a willful decision to deny the existence of God. Actually, the scientists have the least excuse for not believing in God. And you need to keep asking questions and looking for answers. There's a lot of resources out there. Last slide. Where do we need to begin? In Acts chapter 17, go to the next slide. I wrote it out here for you. If you brought your Bible, you can look. It says here in Acts chapter 17, God put people in the places and the times so that we would reach out and find Him. And God has done this so that each one of us can reach out and figure out who He is. Why did He create the universe? Why did He create life? Why did we have this conversation today? It was to point to the heavens so that you would look and say there must be a God. What does He want? Next slide. In Hebrews 1, verses 1 through 3, not only has God talked through nature and the universe to show us something bigger than ourselves in general revelation, He's also given us specific revelation. It says here in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times in various ways, but in these last days, He has spoken to us by His Son. So the Bible is clear that God sent Jesus to speak to us and tell us what? The Son is the exact representation of God's being. So that if we want to know this ultimate cause, who really cares very much about us, you get to know Jesus. And if you get to know Jesus, then you get to know this Maker behind the scenes. And then lastly, last slide. In John chapter 1, hit the next one, here we go. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through Him all things were made. Without Him nothing was made that has been made. Sounds like the creation. In Him was life, and the light was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness is not overcome it. The Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us. We have seen His glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. So here the big W word is not only the Bible, it is Jesus. So God created the universe to astound us, to look up and go, there must be a God. Then it says He sent Jesus in the flesh so that we would get to know who God is. And then He gave us His Word. The Word that we can read so we can get to know this Jesus who can show us God. So this is really where the talk is really meant to end. And so if you're visiting with us today, I really highly encourage you, ask a lot more questions. Also, with the person you came with, ask them, show me some of this stuff. I didn't know this was in the Bible. I didn't know it was scientifically accurate when it talked about it. I'm kind of amazed. I'd like to get to know this God a little bit more. And I want to let you know I'll be down here at the front for any questions you may have. And every Sunday I'm usually down here on the second and third row. And if I didn't cover all of this clearly enough for you, or you'd like to talk more about it, I'd be more than happy to spend some time talking